The frost had settled like delicate lacework across the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, transforming the familiar village into something from a Christmas card. Even the weathered stones of St. Mary's Church seemed to sparkle in the crisp December air as the villagers made their way up the gravel path for the traditional Christmas Eve carol service. Their breath formed small clouds in the cold, and their careful steps crunched softly on the frost-touched ground. At the church porch, young Nora Pike distributed candles from a wicker basket, her nervous hands trembling slightly as she offered each villager their small beacon of light. She had been helping at the church for only 6 months since arriving from London under circumstances that remained diplomatically unspoken in polite society. Her aunt, Mrs. Millicent Pike, had taken her in without question, though the village gossips had provided plenty of speculation about the girl's sudden departure from the city. The gathering storm. Lady Agnes Weatherby swept past the porch with the authority of someone who had never doubted her place in the world's hierarchy. At 72, she remained the undisputed matriarch of St. Mary Mead, her silver hair perfectly coiffed beneath a black velvet hat adorned with holly. She took not one but 2 candles from Nora's basket, as if her station entitled her to extra illumination, and made her way to the front pew that had been reserved for the Weatherby family since the church's consecration. Miss Jane Marple selected her usual spot in the 3rd pew from the front, where the draughts were least troublesome and the view of human nature most instructive. At 73, she had learned that the most fascinating dramas often unfolded in the most ordinary settings. She settled herself with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood the value of being overlooked, her knitting bag at her feet and her sharp blue eyes already cataloguing the evening's cast of characters. The church filled with the comfortable murmur of familiar voices, mixing with the rustle of winter coats and the soft shuffle of feet on ancient stone. Mrs. Beatrice Cray, the formidable choir mistress, surveyed her domain from the choir stalls with the expression of a general reviewing troops before battle. Her gaze lingered disapprovingly on young Timothy Hartwell, whose voice had been cracking unpredictably during rehearsals, before moving on to assess the placement of the holly decorations that adorned each pew end. Dr. Peter Alderwick arrived with the measured haste of a country physician, his medical bag never far from his side even during social occasions. He had been Lady Agnes's doctor for nearly 20 years and had grown accustomed to her imperious summons at all hours. Tonight, however, he seemed more relaxed than usual, exchanging pleasantries with the Reverend Samuel Latchford, whose youthful enthusiasm for his calling sometimes exceeded his practical experience. Undercurrents and observations. In the pew directly behind Miss Marple, Mrs. Ida Prowse, the village postmistress, whispered urgently to her companion about the latest bit of intelligence that had passed through her capable hands. "Mark my words, Mrs. Templeman, there's trouble brewing at Weatherby Hall. I've seen the letters from London lawyers, and they're not the friendly sort. Something about debts and mortgages that should have been settled years ago." Mrs. Templeman, who measured the village's moral temperature by the frequency of bicycle bell ringing among the local children, nodded knowingly. "Well, there's that Mr. Lionel Kent who's been calling regularly. An antique dealer, they say, but I've heard he's more interested in buying than selling these days." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm, but her attention sharpened at the mention of Mr. Kent. She had observed him during his visits to the village, noting his particular interest in the finer details of local properties and their contents. There was something about his manner that reminded her of a cat studying a particularly promising mouse hole. The object of their discussion sat 3 rows ahead, his well-tailored coat and expensive gloves marking him as someone from outside their small community. Lionel Kent had the sort of polished appearance that spoke of success in business, though Miss Marple had noticed that his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who viewed sentiment as a luxury he couldn't afford. Julian Weatherby, Lady Agnes's only son, took his place in the family pew with the resigned air of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than embracing a tradition. At 45, he possessed the kind of faded handsomeness that suggested better days, and his clothes, while well cut, showed the subtle signs of careful maintenance rather than recent purchase. His relationship with his formidable mother had long been a source of village speculation, particularly regarding the question of inheritance and the mounting debts that seemed to shadow the once proud Wetherby estate. The service begins. As the Reverend Latchford called the congregation to worship, candles were lit in a gentle chain of golden light that transformed the ancient church into something magical. The familiar scent of beeswax mingled with the pine fragrance from the Christmas decorations, creating an atmosphere of peace and reverence that seemed to settle over the gathering like a blessing. The opening notes of Once in Royal David City rose from the choir, led by young Master Geoffrey Templeman's clear soprano, though Miss Marple noticed that his voice showed signs of the changes that would soon end his singing career. Mrs. Cray conducted with subtle gestures, her experienced eye catching every wavering note and uncertain entrance. Lady Agnes sang with the confident voice of someone who had never doubted her right to be heard, though Miss Marple observed that she paused occasionally to retrieve a small silver tin from her muff. The peppermints within were Lady Agnes's concession to the advancing years and the winter cold that seemed to settle more deeply in her chest each season. During the second carol, Miss Marple noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Lady Agnes, who prided herself on perfect posture and unwavering attention to propriety, seemed to sway slightly in her pew. Her candle, held in a gloved hand that had been steady moments before, began to waver, casting dancing shadows across her face. The moment of crisis. It was during the third verse of Hark the Herald Angels Sing that Lady Agnes Wetherby's participation in the Christmas Eve service came to its sudden and final end. Her voice, which had been strong and clear, faltered and stopped altogether. The candle in her hand tilted dangerously, dripping hot wax onto the sable trim of her coat, where it hardened into small white drops against the dark fur. Mrs. Cray, whose attention never wavered from her choir even during the most dramatic moments, was the first to notice that something was seriously amiss. Her conducting became slightly more emphatic as she tried to maintain the carol's rhythm while keeping one eye on the front pew, where Lady Agnes had begun to slump forward in a most uncharacteristic display of physical weakness. The Reverend Latchford's wife, Charlotte, who had been managing the collection plates with her usual anxious efficiency, noticed the disturbance and moved quietly toward the front of the church. Her gentle touch on Lady Agnes's shoulder confirmed what the observant few had already begun to suspect. Something was terribly wrong. "Doctor," Mrs. Cray said quietly, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the continuing carol without causing general alarm. Dr. Alderwick was already moving, his professional instincts overriding the social conventions that normally govern church behavior. He reached Lady Agnes's side as the last notes of the carol faded into an uncertain silence, his practiced fingers seeking the pulse points that would tell him what he already feared to discover. The terrible truth. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of prayer, but the heavy stillness that accompanies the presence of death. Dr. Alderwick's face, normally composed and reassuring, took on the grave expression that his patients' families had learned to dread. "I'm afraid Lady Agnes has passed away," he announced quietly, his words carrying clearly in the hushed church. "It appears to have been her heart." The collective intake of breath that followed was soft but unmistakable, the sound of a community absorbing unexpected tragedy. Julian Wetherby, who had been standing for the carol, sat down heavily, his face pale with shock and something that might have been relief. Miss Marple, her knitting forgotten in her lap, observed the scene with the careful attention she had learned to apply to moments of crisis. Her eyes took in the small, silver tin that had fallen from Lady Agnes's muff and now lay open on the pew floor, its contents scattered. She noticed the particular way the candle wax had dripped onto the sable coat and the faint but unmistakable scent that seemed to linger in the air. Something sharp and medicinal that had nothing to do with church candles or Christmas greenery. Most significantly, she observed the reactions of those around her. Mr. Kent's expression of polite concern that didn't quite reach his calculating eyes. Nora Pike's sudden pallor and the way her hand unconsciously moved to cover a small scratch on her wrist. Julian Weatherby's struggle between appropriate grief and poorly concealed anxiety about what Lady Agnes's death might mean for his precarious financial situation. As the Reverend Latchford began the delicate process of managing both tragedy and congregation, Miss Marple quietly bent to retrieve her knitting. In doing so, she noticed something that no one else seemed to have observed, a small, round white object that had rolled beneath the pew. A peppermint from Lady Agnes's tin, but one that seemed somehow different from the others, with a faint discoloration that spoke of something more than simple age. The Christmas Eve service had ended not with joy and celebration, but with death and questions that would need very careful answering. As the villagers began to file out into the cold night air, their festive mood replaced by hushed conversations and worried glances, Miss Marple remained in her pew for a few moments longer. She had learned that the immediate aftermath of tragedy often revealed as much as the tragedy itself, and tonight she sensed that Lady Agnes Weatherby's sudden death was merely the first note in a much more complex and dangerous composition. The candles continued to flicker in their holders, casting the same warm light they had moments before, but now their glow seemed to illuminate not celebration, but the beginning of a mystery that would test all of Miss Marple's considerable understanding of human nature and its capacity for both love and murder. The frost that had blessed St. Mary Mead on Christmas Eve now seemed to carry a different quality entirely, as if the very air had been chilled by more than winter weather. News of Lady Agnes Weatherby's sudden death spread through the village with the efficiency of the morning milk delivery, though considerably less welcome. By the time the church bells rang for Christmas morning service, a subdued affair that many chose to forego, 3 distinct theories had crystallized in the collective consciousness of St. Mary Mead, each finding eager adherents among residents who had spent sleepless hours pondering the previous evening's shocking events. The village theories emerge. Mrs. Ida Prowse, whose position as postmistress granted her both access to correspondence and authority in its interpretation, held unofficial court in her small shop despite the holiday closure. Through the frosted windows, neighbors could see her animated gestures as she dispensed her particular brand of postal intelligence to anyone willing to listen. "Mark my words," Mrs. Prowse declared with the confidence of someone who had read far too many official letters. It was the strain of those debts that stopped her heart. Lady Agnes was facing complete ruin. I've seen the correspondence from London solicitors. The shame of losing Weatherby Hall would have killed her faster than any medical condition. Mrs. Beatrice Cray, still processing the trauma of her carol service being interrupted by death, offered a more charitable interpretation to the Reverend Latchford's wife. She was 72 and proud as Lucifer, Mrs. Cray explained, adjusting her black choir robes. Dr. Alderwick had been warning her about her heart for months. She'd been taking those peppermints to settle her stomach, and some people simply refuse to acknowledge their mortality until it's too late. The third theory belonged to darker whispers that circulated among those who remembered Lady Agnes's less charitable dealings over the years. Old Mr. Giles, the retired head gardener, muttered to anyone who would listen about unnatural causes. "That woman had enemies," he declared, adjusting his weathered cap. "Not the sort to make them openly, mind you, but she had a way of getting what she wanted, and not everyone appreciated her methods." Miss Marple's morning observations. Miss Marple spent her Christmas morning in quiet contemplation, ostensibly tending to her frost-touched garden while observing the unusual patterns of activity around the village. From her cottage window, she noted the steady stream of official-looking visitors making their way to Weatherby Hall, where Julian Weatherby was presumably dealing with the immediate aftermath of his mother's death. Dr. Alderwick's motor car had been joined by a sleek black automobile that suggested government business of some kind. Most intriguingly, she observed Julian himself leaving the hall twice during the morning, first toward the closed bank, where he spent several minutes peering through windows and trying door handles, then to the cottage where the retired village solicitor lived. His expression upon emerging from the latter meeting told a story of complications rather than relief. Mr. Lionel Kent's behavior also warranted attention. The antique dealer had taken breakfast at the Swan Inn, where Mrs. Templeman reported he had made several telephone calls to London and spent considerable time studying legal documents. His inquiries about the contents of Wetherby Hall struck Miss Marple as premature, even for a businessman. Most concerning was young Nora Pike, whose nervous energy seemed to have intensified overnight. Miss Marple observed her hurrying toward the village telephone box, rather than attending any of the expected condolence calls, her usually neat appearance disheveled and her shoulders hunched with anxiety. Official complications. The morning's most significant development came when Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham, his presence indicating that Lady Agnes's death was receiving more than routine attention. Dr. Alderwick, emerging from a lengthy consultation at the vicarage, appeared less certain than he had the previous evening. "Natural causes, Inspector," he repeated to Slack, though his tone carried less conviction. Her heart had been troublesome, and the emotional strain of the service. "All the same," Inspector Slack concluded, "sudden death of a prominent person in a public place. The coroner will require a post-mortem examination." Julian Wetherby received this news with a curious mixture of indignation and poorly concealed anxiety. "It's an outrage to her memory," he protested, though Miss Marple noted that his objection seemed more concerned with inconvenience than genuine grief. As Christmas Day progressed and the theories multiplied, Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain that Lady Agnes Wetherby's death would prove neither natural nor simple. The scattered peppermints, the unusual discoloration she had observed, and most importantly, the patterns of human behavior she witnessed, all pointed toward a truth far more sinister than a weak heart succumbing to winter cold. In her considerable experience, when death visited so conveniently, it rarely came uninvited. Christmas afternoon found Miss Marple returning to St. Mary's Church with the perfectly reasonable excuse of retrieving her forgotten prayer book. The building felt different now, colder, emptied of its festive warmth and filled instead with the lingering presence of tragedy. Mrs. Charlotte Latchford, armed with cleaning supplies and wearing the determined expression of someone combating chaos through domestic order, was methodically removing candle wax from the wooden pew ends. "Such a blessing you've come, Miss Marple," Charlotte murmured, her voice carrying the strain of the past day's events. "The inspector has been asking the most particular questions about who touched what and when. I've been trying to restore everything to proper order." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while her sharp eyes surveyed the front pew where Lady Agnes had spent her final moments. The sable coat and silver tin were gone, claimed by official investigation, but other details remained. A delicate handkerchief lay forgotten on the hassock, and beneath the pew, Miss Marple noticed a faint ring of hardened wax surrounding something more intriguing, a small area where pale dust had settled into the stone's ancient grooves. "The peppermints scattered terribly," Charlotte continued, following Miss Marple's gaze. "I gathered them all up for the inspector, though one had rolled quite far under the pew. Such a mess, and Lady Agnes was always so particular about her things." Miss Marple knelt carefully, ostensibly to examine the hymnal rack, while observing the dust pattern more closely. It suggested something had been crushed or dissolved, leaving behind a residue that spoke of more than simple sugar. Lady Agnes was indeed particular about her habits, she agreed mildly. "I believe she always selected her peppermints in a certain order." "Oh yes, always the largest first. She said it was practical. The smaller ones were less likely to last through a long sermon." Charlotte's innocent observation carried implications that Miss Marple filed away carefully. Emerging from the church, Miss Marple encountered young Timothy Hartwell, whose boy soprano had been the pride of Mrs. Cray's choir until nature began asserting other plans. The lad approached with the earnest manner of someone carrying important information. "Miss Marple," he began hesitantly, "I noticed something during the service that seemed odd. One of Lady Agnes's mints looked different from the others, sort of chalky white instead of clear like the rest. I thought perhaps it was just old, but now with all this talk of investigations..." Miss Marple's gentle encouragement drew out additional details that confirmed her growing suspicions. Timothy had been positioned perfectly to observe Lady Agnes's habits during the carol service, and his young eyes had caught what adult preoccupations had missed. Her next stop was the post office, where Mrs. Prowse was conducting unofficial business despite the holiday closure. Through the frosted windows, Miss Marple observed Julian Weatherby completing urgent correspondence with the hurried movements of a man under considerable pressure. "Sending telegrams to London solicitors," Mrs. Prowse confided when Julian departed. "Third one today, and all marked urgent. Whatever Lady Agnes's financial situation was, it's clearly not improving with her death." The afternoon's most revealing encounter came at the vicarage, where Dr. Alderwick was emerging from a lengthy consultation with Inspector Slack. The doctor's usual composed demeanor showed hairline cracks, and he repeatedly cleaned his spectacles, a nervous habit Miss Marple had observed during his more difficult diagnosis. "Natural causes," he was saying to the inspector, though his tone carried less conviction than the previous evening. "Her heart condition was genuine, Inspector. The emotional strain of the service, the cold." "All the same, Doctor," Inspector Slack replied, "we'll need that post-mortem examination. Sudden death in a public place. Prominent citizen. The coroner insists on thoroughness." Miss Marple noted Dr. Alderwick's particular discomfort with this decision, and Julian Weatherby's poorly concealed anxiety when informed. For someone grieving a beloved mother, he seemed remarkably concerned with procedural inconveniences. Her final observation of the day came during her evening walk past Weatherby Hall. Despite the family's mourning, several motor cars occupied the circular drive, and through the tall windows she glimpsed men in dark suits, examining furniture and artwork with the systematic attention of professional appraisers. Julian stood supervising their work with an expression that mixed desperation with barely concealed hope. Returning home, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with a cup of tea and a small notebook. She wrote 3 words: habit, opportunity, disguise. Beneath them, she carefully listed the day's observations: the dust pattern under the pew, Timothy's description of the unusual peppermint, Julian's urgent correspondence, and Dr. Alderwick's nervous behavior. Lady Agnes Weatherby had been a creature of rigid habits, predictable in her preferences and routines. Someone had understood those habits well enough to exploit them fatally. The question now was determining who possessed both the knowledge and the means to transform a simple peppermint into an instrument of murder. Boxing Day arrived with the leaden sky and bitter wind that seemed to mirror the village's collective unease. Inspector Slack had commandeered the morning room at Weatherby Hall, transforming the once elegant space into an impromptu headquarters where the scent of old roses and beeswax gave way to the sharper odors of official business and human anxiety. A constable arranged files on the mahogany writing desk, while Slack himself stood before the smoking fireplace, his weathered face grave with the weight of unwelcome news. "The post-mortem results came through this morning," he announced to the assembled gathering, which included Julian Weatherby, Dr. Alderwick, and the Reverend Latchford. Lady Agnes Weatherby was murdered. Digitalis poisoning, a concentrated dose sufficient to stop her heart within minutes of consumption. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Julian's sharp intake of breath and the soft rustle of papers as the constable continued his methodical organization. Dr. Alderwick's face had gone pale, his usual professional composure cracking visibly as the implications settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Digitalis can be extracted from common foxglove, Inspector Slack continued, his eyes moving carefully from face to face. Any competent gardener would know the process, and the plants grow wild throughout this area. What makes this particularly troubling is that the poison was almost certainly administered through one of Lady Agnes's peppermints, someone who knew her habits intimately. Julian Weatherby struggled to maintain his dignity under the inspector's scrutiny, though his hands trembled as he reached for his handkerchief. "Inspector, I understand that my financial difficulties make me an obvious suspect, but I must protest." "Your financial difficulties are considerable, Mr. Weatherby," Slack interrupted, consulting his notebook. "Debts exceeding £15,000, creditors threatening legal action, and your mother's well-documented reluctance to assist you further. Her death removes the primary obstacle too, settling your obligations. It also saddles me with an estate so heavily mortgaged that inheritance brings more problems than solutions," Julian replied with bitter honesty. "The hall is entailed, Inspector. I cannot sell it, and the income barely covers the interest on existing loans. Mother's death creates as many difficulties as it resolves." Dr. Alderwick cleared his throat nervously, his spectacles requiring frequent cleaning as the questioning continued. "Inspector, I must mention that I prescribed digitoxin for Lady Agnes's heart condition. However, my supplies are fully accounted for, and the therapeutic doses I administered were carefully measured and supervised by Mrs. Dutton." "We'll need to examine your records and remaining supplies, Doctor," Slack replied, though the concentration found in Lady Agnes's system was far higher than any medicinal dose would require. The morning's interrogations revealed a web of access and opportunity that complicated rather than simplified the investigation. Mrs. Dutton confirmed that Nora Pike had visited Lady Agnes's private rooms on Christmas Eve, ostensibly to deliver a wreath base for the church decorations. The young woman had been alone in the bedroom for several minutes while Lady Agnes sorted through correspondence in her sitting room. "She seemed nervous," Mrs. Dutton reported, "jumped when I spoke to her from the doorway. But then, she's been skittish since arriving from London. Her aunt says it's the change of circumstances, but I've wondered if there wasn't more to her departure than family charity." Lionel Kent's examination proved equally revealing. The antique dealer admitted to detailed knowledge of Weatherby Hall's contents and confirmed his interest in purchasing specific pieces to satisfy the estate's obligations. Lady Agnes was reluctant to part with the most valuable items, he explained smoothly. She preferred to sell pieces of lesser worth, which would have been financially imprudent. Our discussions had become somewhat heated. "Heated enough to consider alternative solutions, Mr. Kent?" Inspector Slack inquired. "Heated enough to consider taking my business elsewhere," Kent replied with studied calm, though Miss Marple, who had arrived with tea and sympathy for the household, noted the slight tension in his jaw that suggested the conversations had been more acrimonious than he cared to admit. As the official questioning continued, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the investigation's direction. Julian Weatherby, despite his obvious financial motives, seemed more like a man overwhelmed by circumstances than one who had orchestrated them. His anxiety appeared genuine rather than calculated, and his behavior since his mother's death suggested someone caught unprepared rather than executing a careful plan. Her attention was drawn to smaller details that others overlooked. In Lady Agnes's bedroom, she noticed a faint residue of white powder on the silver-backed brush that sat on the dressing table. Powder that had no business being there given Lady Agnes's meticulous personal habits. The arrangement of items on the bedside table suggested recent disturbance, and the position of the peppermint tin indicated it had been moved and replaced, though not quite in its original location. Most significantly, Miss Marple observed the reactions of those being questioned. Nora Pike's nervousness went beyond natural anxiety about police interrogation. There was a quality of desperate fear that suggested secrets far more dangerous than a simple village scandal. Dr. Alderwick's discomfort seemed rooted in professional concerns about his prescribed medications, but his repeated emphasis on proper procedures suggested a man protecting himself against implications he found deeply troubling. As the day progressed and Inspector Slack's focus narrowed increasingly on Julian Weatherby as the most viable suspect, Miss Marple found herself remembering her decades of observation in St. Mary Mead. In her experience, the most obvious solution was rarely the correct one when murder visited their peaceful village. Someone had possessed intimate knowledge of Lady Agnes's habits, access to her personal belongings, and expertise with botanical poisons. More importantly, someone had felt desperate enough to risk everything rather than allow Lady Agnes to continue living with whatever dangerous knowledge she possessed. The question now was not simply who had the means and opportunity to commit murder, but who among them harbored secrets worth killing to protect. As Inspector Slack prepared to make what seemed an inevitable arrest, Miss Marple sensed that the true complexity of the case was only beginning to emerge. The morning after Boxing Day brought an unexpected chill to Weatherby Hall that had nothing to do with the December frost. Miss Marple arrived with a basket of preserves and the innocent purpose of offering comfort to the bereaved household, though her sharp eyes immediately catalogued the subtle changes that murder had wrought upon the once orderly estate. Mrs. Dutton, the stalwart housekeeper whose starch deficiency had weathered decades of Lady Agnes's exacting standards, moved through her duties with the mechanical precision of someone struggling to maintain normalcy in circumstances that defied comprehension. "Such a terrible business, Miss Marple," Mrs. Dutton confided as she arranged the preserves in the pantry. Lady Agnes was so particular about her routines. Every evening she would take a peppermint from her silver tin before retiring, always the largest one first. She said they lasted longer through her prayers. The tin lived on her bedside table, right next to her spectacles, never moved from that spot in 20 years. Miss Marple absorbed this information while observing the household's subtle disruptions. In Lady Agnes's bedroom, which Mrs. Dutton had maintained exactly as her mistress left it, she noticed a faint residue of white powder dusting the bristles of the silver-backed hairbrush. Powder that had no business being there given Lady Agnes's minimal use of cosmetics. The arrangement of items on the bedside table suggested recent disturbance, and the position of the empty peppermint tin indicated it had been moved and replaced, though not quite in its original location. Her next visit was to the Pike cottage, where she found Nora in a state of barely controlled agitation. The young woman's nervous energy had intensified rather than diminished since Lady Agnes's death, and her usual neat appearance showed signs of sleepless nights and anxious preoccupation. Mrs. Pike, ever practical in her kindness, fussed over tea while casting worried glances at her niece. "You were at the Hall on Christmas Eve, weren't you, dear?" Miss Marple inquired gently, accepting a cup with the casual air of someone making polite conversation. "Something about ribbon for the church decorations?" Nora's response came too quickly, rehearsed in the manner of someone who had been preparing for such questions. "Mrs. Cray sent me to ask Lady Agnes for additional supplies. I only went to the bedroom to fetch ribbon from the dressing-table drawer. I was clumsy, knocked over the hairbrush and got powder on my hands." She unconsciously rubbed her fingers together, as if still feeling the residue. Miss Marple noted the faint scratch on Nora's wrist, now healing but still visible, the sort of mark that wire or a sharp tin edge might leave. More significantly, she observed the way Nora's explanation carefully avoided mentioning how long she had been alone in Lady Agnes's private chambers, or what else she might have encountered during her visit. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors to Weatherby Hall in the form of 2 London solicitors whose expensive overcoats and urgent manner suggested business that transcended normal legal procedures. Miss Marple, who happened to be returning Mrs. Dutton's borrowed serving dish, found herself present when these gentlemen delivered news that transformed Julian Weatherby's pale anxiety into something approaching desperation. "Your mother's financial arrangements were more complex than standard estate matters, Mr. Weatherby," the senior solicitor explained with professional gravity. Certain creditors are pressing for immediate resolution of outstanding obligations. The estate's liquidity is insufficient for current demands. Julian struggled to maintain dignity under this additional pressure was painful to observe. His hands shook as he reviewed documents that clearly outlined debts exceeding anything the village had imagined, secured by arrangements that made Lady Agnes's continued existence essential to maintaining even the pretense of solvency. Inspector Slack's investigation had meanwhile uncovered evidence that cast Julian in an increasingly unfavorable light. A leather-bound volume on poisonous plants, discovered in his study with pages on digitals extensively annotated, suggested premeditation that was difficult to explain away. A receipt from a London chemical supplier, dated 3 weeks prior, could be interpreted as procurement of materials for poison extraction, though Julian insisted it documented fertilizer purchases for his prize-winning roses. "Botanical interest is hardly criminal, Inspector," Julian protested, though his voice carried the hollow ring of someone whose explanations sounded inadequate, even to himself. Miss Marple's evening visit to Dr. Alderwick revealed additional troubling undercurrents. The physician's usual composed demeanor had given way to nervous energy that manifested in rapid speech and frequent adjustments to his spectacles. His emphasis on proper medical procedures seemed defensive, as if protecting himself against implications he found deeply disturbing. "My digitoxin supplies are strictly accounted for," he repeated for perhaps the 3rd time. "Every tablet is documented, every prescription supervised. If someone obtained digitalis for criminal purposes, they did not acquire it through legitimate medical channels." As night settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain that Inspector Slack's focus on Julian Weatherby, while understandable, was leading the investigation away from the truth. The evidence was too convenient, the motives too obvious, the timing too perfect. In her considerable experience with human nature, the most carefully orchestrated crimes often succeeded by directing suspicion toward the most logical suspects while concealing the true perpetrator's deadly calculations. Someone had possessed intimate knowledge of Lady Agnes's habits, access to her private chambers, and expertise with botanical poisons. More importantly, someone had felt desperate enough to risk everything rather than allow Lady Agnes to continue living with whatever dangerous knowledge she possessed. The question now was determining which of her neighbors had harbored secrets worth killing to protect. The 3rd morning after Christmas brought revelations that shifted the investigation's focus, like winter light through stained glass windows. Miss Marple, armed with her knitting bag and an innocent desire to check on the bereaved household, found herself at the center of conversations that would illuminate the true complexity of Lady Agnes Weatherby's murder. At the vicarage, Charlotte Latchford poured tea for what appeared to be a comfort gathering but functioned more like an unofficial inquiry. Mrs. Cray, Mrs. Templeman, and Miss Marple sat by the fire, while the Reverend hovered with his characteristic mixture of earnestness and ineffectuality. "Such a dreadful thing to happen during our carol service," Charlotte murmured, her hands trembling slightly as she managed the sugar tongs. Lady Agnes was so particular about her habits. She always took a peppermint from her silver tin during evening prayers, the largest one first. She said they lasted longer. Miss Marple's gentle inquiries revealed that Lady Agnes obtained her peppermints from Mr. Fallow's chemist shop in Much Benham, delivered fortnightly in sealed tins. "Pure peppermints," Charlotte explained. "No coloring or artificial flavoring." She was quite adamant about that. "Not the sort of thing one accepts from admirers," Mrs. Templeman added with barely concealed relish. "Though I heard Mr. Kent sent a Christmas hamper." Charlotte's cheeks flushed slightly. "He did send peppermint creams among other delicacies, but Mrs. Dutton explained that Lady Agnes would never touch them. She was devoted to her own plain mints." This distinction between peppermint creams and plain peppermints struck Miss Marple as significant, though she filed the observation away without comment. Her subsequent visit to the Swan Inn, where Lionel Kent maintained his temporary residence, proved illuminating in ways that confirmed her growing suspicions. "Such a thoughtful hamper you sent Lady Agnes," Miss Marple observed with her characteristic gentle manner. "I particularly admired the peppermint creams." Kent's response came too quickly, with the practiced smoothness of someone who had prepared for such questions. Mrs. Dutton conveyed that they wouldn't suit Lady Agnes's preferences. The creams were redirected to the servants' hall, I believe. Miss Marple noted the slight relaxation in Kent's posture, too swift and too calculated for genuine relief. Her afternoon encounter with old Mr. Giles, the retired head gardener, provided additional pieces to the puzzle that was taking shape in her mind. "Someone's been at the foxglove clumps by the East Terrace," he reported, stabbing the frozen ground with his walking stick. "Middle of October, there was a tidy handful of leaves gone, and not by my doing. I've seen that young Miss Pike about the herb beds, too, asking what's good for palpitations. 'Not foxglove,' says I, 'unless you fancy the undertaker.' Went white as a sheet, she did." The revelation about Nora Pike's background came through Mrs. Prowse, who had received official inquiries from London police. The young woman had previously been employed as a companion to an elderly widow in Belgravia, whose death from apparent heart failure had raised sufficient suspicions to warrant investigation, though no charges had been filed. More troubling was Miss Marple's discovery, during a carefully casual conversation with Nora herself, of the girl's previous employment at Pargeter's Confectionery in Bond Street. "Such a useful skill," Miss Marple observed mildly, "hollowing a sweet and resealing it. Boys at my school used to hide halfpennies that way." Nora's reaction, a mixture of terror and recognition, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about the method used to administer the poison. The girl possessed exactly the expertise needed to hollow out a peppermint, insert a fatal dose of digitalis, and reseal it so expertly that detection would be nearly impossible. Dr. Alderwick's consultation revealed additional technical details that supported this theory. A strong peppermint might mask the initial bitterness of digitalis, he admitted reluctantly, and if a tablet were concealed inside a sweet, one might suck unsuspectingly until the poison was released. The discovery of white powder residue on Lady Agnes's hairbrush, combined with Mrs. Dutton's report of missing icing sugar from the larder, suggested that someone had used confectioner's sugar to reseal the tampered peppermint. The evidence was building toward an inescapable conclusion about both method and perpetrator. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the investigation's apparent simplicity. In her considerable experience with human nature, the most obvious solution was rarely the correct one when murder visited their peaceful village. Someone had possessed intimate knowledge of Lady Agnes's habits, access to her personal belongings, and expertise with both botanical poisons and confectionery techniques. More importantly, someone had felt desperate enough to risk everything rather than allow Lady Agnes to continue living with whatever dangerous knowledge she possessed. As Inspector Slack prepared to focus his investigation on Nora Pike as the prime suspect, Miss Marple sensed that the true complexity of the case was only beginning to emerge, and that the real murderer remained hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of innocence. The fourth morning after Christmas brought news that struck St. Mary Mead with the force of winter lightning. Inspector Slack had arrested Nora Pike on suspicion of murdering Lady Agnes Weatherby, and the young woman now sat in a cell at Much Benham, her tearful confession having apparently closed the case with satisfying efficiency. Mrs. Prowse, breathless with the importance of bearing such momentous intelligence, had scarcely unlocked her post office before the entire village learned that justice had been swift and decisive. Miss Marple received this development while arranging winter chrysanthemums in her sitting room, though her attention was divided between the flowers and Mrs. Templeman's detailed account delivered through the morning's gossip network. According to Inspector Slack's official statement, digitalis powder had been discovered hidden in Nora's face powder tin, along with correspondence from London that revealed her desperate financial circumstances and the threats that had driven her from her previous employment. The village responds. The arrest had followed what Dr. Alderwick described as Nora's complete emotional collapse under questioning. She had confessed to extracting digitalis from foxglove leaves gathered from the hall's gardens, then concealing the poison inside one of Lady Agnes's beloved peppermints, using techniques learned during her employment at Pargeter's confectionery. Her motive, as revealed through tearful admissions, centered on Lady Agnes's discovery of her troubled past and threats of exposure that would have destroyed any hope of securing respectable employment elsewhere. Mrs. Pike, devastated by her niece's arrest, received a steady stream of visitors offering comfort that felt more like morbid curiosity. "She's been writing letters frantically since Christmas Eve," the poor woman confided to Miss Marple during an afternoon visit, but desperate letters to former employers, begging for character references. She was trying to secure a position in Yorkshire, away from whatever trouble followed her from London. The Reverend Latchford, who had visited Nora in custody, returned with troubling observations that he shared privately with Miss Marple. She insists she acted alone, but her knowledge of Lady Agnes's habits seems remarkably incomplete for someone who planned such a careful murder. She couldn't explain how she knew about the peppermint tin's precise location on the bedside table or Lady Agnes's evening routine of taking a mint before prayers. Miss Marple's growing doubts. Dr. Alderwick's private consultation with Miss Marple revealed technical inconsistencies that deepened her concerns about accepting the obvious solution. Nora's description of the poison preparation contains fundamental errors, he explained, nervously adjusting his spectacles. She claims to have boiled foxglove leaves in ordinary water, but digitalis extraction requires alcohol and precise temperature control. Her method would have produced a weak solution at best, certainly not the concentrated dose that killed Lady Agnes. Miss Marple's careful examination of the evidence, conducted with Mrs. Pike's desperate permission, revealed details that troubled rather than convinced her. The tin of face powder that allegedly contained digitalis residue showed signs of recent disturbance. The powder's surface displayed fingerprint impressions that were too fresh for someone who had supposedly used the hiding place weeks earlier. More significantly, the location was obvious rather than clever, exactly where a hasty search would look first. The letters from London painted a picture of desperation rather than calculated malice. Nora had indeed fled her previous position under suspicious circumstances, but the correspondence suggested she was escaping accusations of theft, not embracing expertise in murder. Her former employer's family suspected financial impropriety, and their threats involved legal prosecution rather than social exposure. Observing the observers. During her evening visit to Weatherby Hall, Miss Marple observed reactions that sharpened her detective instincts. Julian Weatherby received news of the arrest with visible relief that seemed disproportionate to simple justice being served. Mrs. Dutton expressed genuine shock, insisting that Nora had appeared nervous but not calculating during her Christmas Eve visit. "She knocked over my hairbrush and apologized repeatedly," the housekeeper recalled. "Hardly the behavior of someone executing a carefully planned murder." Most significantly, Lionel Kent's response struck Miss Marple as carefully modulated rather than genuinely surprised. His expressions of sympathy for the Pike family carried subtle undertones of satisfaction, as if Nora's guilt resolved complications that extended beyond village scandal. When Miss Marple mentioned the technical difficulties in Nora's confession, Kent's dismissal came too quickly, with the practiced ease of someone who had prepared for such questions. The technical truth. Dr. Alderwick's medical analysis provided the most compelling evidence against accepting the convenient solution. The concentration of digitalis found in Lady Agnes's system was precisely calculated, he explained privately. Too much would have caused immediate, violent symptoms that might have saved her life through prompt treatment. Too little would have been ineffective. Someone with considerable knowledge of both the poison and Lady Agnes's constitution prepared that fatal dose. The confession itself contained curious gaps that Inspector Slack had overlooked in his eagerness to close the case. Nora could not adequately explain her access to Lady Agnes's private chambers, her knowledge of the peppermint routine, or the sophisticated technique required to hollow and reseal a sweet without detection. Her expertise lay in creating confections, not in the deadly art of concealing poison within them. The uncomfortable truth. As the village settled into the comfortable belief that justice had been served, Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain that Nora Pike was guilty of nothing more than being a perfectly convenient scapegoat. The real murderer remained free, protected by a confession that solved everyone's immediate problems while concealing the true complexity of Lady Agnes Weatherby's death. Someone with intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, unrestricted access to her private chambers, and sophisticated understanding of botanical poisons had orchestrated not merely a murder, but a masterpiece of misdirection. They had studied Nora's background, planted evidence with careful precision, and manipulated the investigation toward an inevitable conclusion that protected their own deadly secret. The question that haunted Miss Marple as she prepared for bed was not whether Nora Pike was innocent. Of that she felt increasingly certain. But which of her neighbors possessed both the expertise and the ruthless calculation necessary to sacrifice an innocent girl to protect themselves from the consequences of murder? Tomorrow, she resolved, she would begin the delicate work of proving what her instincts already knew. The real killer walked free among them, hidden behind a mask of respectability and false sympathy. The morning after Nora Pike's arrest brought an unsettling quiet. To St. Mary Mead, the kind of silence that follows when a community believes justice has been served, but remains troubled by lingering questions. Miss Marple found herself increasingly disturbed, not by what had been discovered, but by what remained unexplained. Her first visitor was Dr. Alderwick, arriving with the nervous energy of a man whose professional conscience had finally overcome his natural caution. Medical revelations. Miss Marple, Dr. Alderwick began, accepting tea with hands that trembled slightly. I've been treating Lady Agnes for what I believed were the natural ailments of advancing age, but I fear I may have been witnessing something far more sinister. His usual composed demeanor had given way to obvious distress as he cleaned his spectacles with obsessive attention. The doctor's revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the case entirely. For several months before her death, Lady Agnes had been experiencing symptoms consistent with chronic digitalis poisoning: nausea, irregular heartbeat, visual disturbances, and digestive problems that she attributed to winter ailments. Dr. Alderwick had assumed she was accidentally overdosing on prescribed medication, but his supplies had always been properly accounted for. Someone had been administering small, calculated doses over an extended period, he explained, his medical training warring with personal anxiety. The Christmas Eve murder wasn't an isolated act. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign designed to weaken her heart and establish a pattern that would make sudden death appear natural. This sophisticated approach required intimate knowledge of Lady Agnes's routines, unrestricted access to her private chambers, and considerable expertise in botanical chemistry. Most significantly, it eliminated Nora Pike as a viable suspect. The confused young woman could never have orchestrated such a methodical poisoning campaign. Evidence inconsistencies. Miss Marple's subsequent conversation with P.C. Fletcher revealed troubling details about the evidence used to convict Nora. The constable, blessed with an eye for trivial details that often proved crucial, remembered the face powder tin's appearance during his initial search of Nora's room. The tin looked quite undisturbed when I first saw it, Fletcher recalled. Powder levels smooth and even, but when Inspector Slack found the digitalis residue, the surface showed clear fingerprint impressions, as if someone had pressed down hard rather than just brushing against it. This observation, combined with the timeline established by old Mr. Giles regarding the foxglove procurement, painted a clear picture of planted evidence. The poison had been obtained weeks before Nora's supposed involvement, and the evidence in her room bore the hallmarks of hasty placement by someone unfamiliar with her personal habits. Systematic investigation. Armed with this new understanding, Miss Marple began a careful reassessment of those who possessed both the means and opportunity for systematic poisoning. Her visit to Mrs. Dutton revealed the crucial pattern of access to Lady Agnes's private chambers during the months when the chronic poisoning occurred. The usual people had regular access. Mrs. Dutton explained, myself for daily housekeeping, Dr. Alderwick for monthly examinations, Mr. Julian when summoned for estate discussions, and that Mr. Kent during his furniture appraisals. He came several times to examine pieces, always with Lady Agnes's permission, but sometimes when she was called away unexpectedly. Lionel Kent's pattern of visits struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. An antique dealer would possess legitimate reasons for examining household items, access to private chambers under business pretenses, and ample opportunity to study Lady Agnes's personal routines without arousing suspicion. Her afternoon encounter with Kent himself provided additional insights disguised as neighborly concern. She found him preparing for departure from St. Mary Mead with the efficient movements of someone whose business had concluded satisfactorily. His relief at Nora's arrest seemed disproportionate to simple satisfaction with justice served. Such a tragedy for the Pike family, Kent murmured while packing expensive belongings. Though I suppose these matters must run their course. My business here is finished now. Estate settlements can be handled through London solicitors. Miss Marple noted the particular care with which Kent packed certain items. A leather case containing what appeared to be precision instruments, several bottles of chemical solutions, and botanical reference books with detailed sections on poisonous plants. For an antique dealer, his interests seemed remarkably diverse and specifically relevant to the methods used in Lady Agnes's murder. Growing certainty. Her gentle inquiries about Kent's expertise in botanical matters elicited responses that were plausible but incomplete. His explanation of professional necessity for understanding plant-based materials in antique authentication was reasonable, yet failed to account for the medical precision instruments or chemical solutions that suggested more sinister applications. Most damning was Kent's intimate familiarity with Lady Agnes's personal habits, gained through months of legitimate business visits that provided perfect cover for studying her routines. He understood the evening peppermint ritual, knew the bedside tin's precise location, and had observed the predictable patterns that made systematic poisoning feasible. Dr. Alderwick's technical analysis confirmed that the concentration of digitalis found in Lady Agnes's system had been precisely calculated. Too much would have caused immediate, violent symptoms that might have saved her through prompt treatment, while too little would have been ineffective. Someone with considerable knowledge of both the poison and Lady Agnes's constitution had prepared each fatal dose. The uncomfortable truth. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead and Lionel Kent prepared for his departure, Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain that justice had been perverted rather than served. Nora Pike's arrest had provided a convenient conclusion that satisfied everyone's immediate needs while protecting the real murderer's carefully constructed facade. The true killer possessed not only the expertise necessary for systematic poisoning, but the ruthless calculation required to sacrifice an innocent girl to protect his own deadly secret. He had studied Nora's troubled background, planted evidence with deliberate precision, and manipulated the investigation toward an inevitable conclusion that would allow him to escape with his reputation intact and his crime unpunished. Tomorrow, Miss Marple resolved, she would begin the delicate work of proving what her instincts already knew with increasing certainty. The real murderer walked free among them, hidden behind a mask of professional respectability and false sympathy. But human nature, in her considerable experience, always revealed its true character to those patient enough to observe carefully and wise enough to understand what they witnessed. The morning of December 30th brought a crystalline frost that transformed St. Mary Mead into something resembling a stage set, all sharp edges and glittering surfaces that seemed to reflect the clarity Miss Marple sought in her final examination of the case. She had spent the previous evening in careful preparation, arranging what she privately termed her psychological test, a delicate series of observations and questions designed to either confirm her suspicions about Lionel Kent or force her to reconsider the entire investigation. The careful preparation. Miss Marple's first call was to Dr. Alderwick, whose medical conscience had finally overcome his natural caution regarding the inconsistencies in Nora Pike's confession. Together, they reviewed the technical impossibilities in the girl's account of digitalis extraction, the sophisticated knowledge required for chronic poisoning, and the precise calculation necessary for the fatal Christmas Eve dose. Someone with considerable expertise orchestrated this entire deception, Dr. Alderwick confirmed, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of professional anxiety. The systematic poisoning over several months, the final concentrated dose, even the method of administration, all require knowledge far exceeding what poor Nora could possibly possess. Armed with this medical confirmation, Miss Marple made her second preparatory visit to Inspector Slack. The conversation required all her gentle persuasion and understated logic to overcome his professional pride in having solved the case so efficiently. "Inspector," she began, settling into the uncomfortable chair in his temporary office, "I believe certain aspects of this case deserve a second examination, particularly the technical sophistication required for the method of murder and the convenient nature of the evidence against Miss Pike. Her presentation was methodical and patient, emphasizing the botanical expertise needed for proper digitalis extraction, the confectionery skills required for seamless peppermint modification, and the intimate knowledge of Lady Agnes's habits necessary for systematic poisoning." Inspector Slack, though initially resistant, possessed enough professional integrity to recognize the validity of her concerns. The psychological examination. With official support secured, Miss Marple arranged what appeared to be a casual farewell visit to Lionel Kent at the Swan Inn. She found him supervising the loading of his carefully packed belongings, his manner suggesting eager anticipation of departure rather than the reluctant conclusion of unfinished business that legitimate estate dealings would require. "Such a relief that this tragic business has been resolved," Miss Marple began conversationally, accepting the chair he offered with practiced courtesy. "Though I confess myself puzzled by certain technical aspects that seem beyond poor Nora's capabilities." Kent's response came with the smooth assurance of someone who had prepared for such questions. These unfortunate cases often involve complexities that ordinary people find difficult to comprehend. The girl clearly possessed more specialized knowledge than her background suggested. Miss Marple's next observation was delivered with deceptive casualness while her knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm. Dr. Alderwick mentioned that proper digitalis extraction requires alcohol solutions and precise temperature control, quite sophisticated chemistry for someone with only basic confectionery training. "I wondered, with your expertise in authenticating antique materials, whether you might explain how such precision could be achieved with simple household methods." The question struck its target with devastating accuracy. Kent's explanation, while technically plausible, revealed knowledge far exceeding what any legitimate antique dealer would require. He described alcohol extraction techniques, concentration methods, and purification processes with the fluency of someone who had studied the subject extensively for practical rather than academic purposes. The revealing details. As their conversation continued, Miss Marple's gentle persistence drew out additional damaging admissions. Kent's familiarity with Lady Agnes's personal routines, gained through months of supposed business visits, had provided perfect opportunity to study her habits and identify the vulnerabilities that systematic poisoning could exploit. His access to her private chambers under legitimate pretenses had allowed him to observe the evening peppermint ritual, and note the precise placement of items that would be crucial for his deadly plan. "The hollowing and resealing of a peppermint," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, "strikes me as requiring considerable skill. Nora's confectionery background would certainly provide such expertise, though I understand the technique demands specialized tools and considerable practice to achieve professional results." Kent's agreement came too readily, accompanied by detailed descriptions of the process, the instruments required, and the specific materials needed for invisible repairs. When Miss Marple deliberately misstated a technical detail about confectioner's sugar, Kent's automatic correction revealed intimate familiarity with advanced techniques that no casual observer could possess. Physical evidence emerges. During a brief interruption when Kent stepped outside to direct the loading of a particularly valuable crate, Miss Marple observed his packing arrangements with the sharp attention she had learned to apply to moments of opportunity. Among the carefully wrapped antiques, she noted items that seemed curiously inappropriate for a legitimate dealer: precision instruments in a leather case, bottles of chemical solutions, and botanical reference works with detailed sections on poisonous plants. Most significantly, she discovered a small glass vial that had rolled beneath Kent's travel desk, the sort of specialized measuring device that Dr. Whodunit had described as essential for preparing concentrated botanical extracts. The vial bore faint residue that caught the morning light with an oily sheen, suggesting recent use for purposes far removed from antique authentication. When Kent returned and noticed her examining the area where the vial had been concealed, his composed demeanor showed the first visible crack. His inquiry about whether she had found anything revealed knowledge of materials he had no legitimate reason to recognize or fear. The inspector's arrival. Inspector Slack's timely appearance, accompanied by P.C. Fletcher, transformed the atmosphere from casual conversation to official interrogation. Kent's reaction, a subtle but unmistakable shift from confident departure to defensive anxiety, provided the behavioral confirmation Miss Marple had sought through her psychological examination. "Mr. Kent," Inspector Slack announced with the gravity his position demanded, "we need to discuss certain inconsistencies that have emerged regarding Lady Agnes Weatherby's death and the evidence against Miss Pike." Kent's protest came with practiced indignation, but Miss Marple observed the telltale signs of genuine fear beneath his polished facade. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coat, his eyes moved constantly toward potential exits, and his voice carried the strained quality of someone whose carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel. The mask begins to slip. As Inspector Slack outlined the technical impossibilities in Nora's confession and the sophisticated expertise required for the actual murder method, Kent's composure eroded with increasing visibility. His explanations became more elaborate and defensive, his gestures more agitated, and his eagerness to conclude the interview more apparent. The final confirmation came when Miss Marple casually mentioned the discovery of the measuring vial and its chemical residue. Kent's immediate inquiry about its contents and current location betrayed intimate knowledge of materials and methods that only the true murderer could possess. "Such specialized equipment," Miss Marple observed mildly, watching his reaction with the careful attention of a naturalist studying a particularly interesting specimen. Dr. Whodunit explained that such precision instruments are essential for preparing concentrated botanical extracts. The sort of thing a chemist might use for legitimate research or someone else might employ for more sinister purposes. Kent's visible relief when she mentioned the vial's apparent emptiness confirmed both his expertise and his guilt. He had been systematically poisoning Lady Agnes for months, using his legitimate business visits to administer carefully calculated doses while studying her habits for the final, fatal application of his deadly knowledge. The gathering storm. As the morning progressed and Inspector Slack's questions became increasingly pointed, the comfortable fiction of Nora Pike's guilt began to dissolve like frost in sunlight. Kent's carefully constructed facade of professional respectability showed increasing strain under the weight of evidence and the relentless pressure of Miss Marple's understated but devastating observations. The psychological examination had succeeded beyond her expectations, revealing not merely guilt, but the sophisticated planning and ruthless calculation that had characterized Lady Agnes Weatherby's murder. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation and the complete exposure of a killer who had nearly succeeded in escaping justice by sacrificing an innocent girl to protect his own deadly secret. As the winter afternoon settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected that human nature, in all its complexity and capacity for both creation and destruction, continued to reveal itself to those patient enough to observe carefully and wise enough to understand what they witnessed. The truth, like the frost that decorated their village, possessed a crystalline clarity that no amount of deception could permanently obscure. The final confrontation unfolded in Weatherby Hall's morning room, where winter sunlight struggled through tall windows to illuminate a gathering that would finally bring justice to St. Mary Mead. Inspector Slack had arranged what he diplomatically termed a clarification meeting, though everyone present understood they were witnessing the methodical dismantling of a carefully constructed deception. Julian Weatherby sat rigidly in his chair. Dr. Alderwick clutched his medical bag with nervous energy, and Lionel Kent maintained his polished composure while positioning himself strategically near the door. Miss Marple occupied her customary unobtrusive corner, knitting needles clicking softly as her sharp blue eyes catalogued every gesture and expression. Nora Pike, released that morning pending the resolution of troubling inconsistencies, sat beside her aunt with the hollow-eyed relief of someone not yet daring to believe in salvation. The Medical Foundation. Dr. Alderwick began the proceedings with professional gravity, his earlier nervousness replaced by the firm resolve of medical conscience. The post-mortem results reveal systematic digitalist poisoning over several months, he announced, adjusting his spectacles with steady hands. Lady Agnes exhibited classic symptoms of chronic poisoning, visual disturbances, irregular heartbeat, digestive problems, all of which I mistakenly attributed to natural aging. The Christmas Eve dose was merely the culmination of a methodical campaign designed to weaken her heart and establish a pattern of declining health. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with deliberate precision. Such sophisticated knowledge of botanical chemistry and medical dosage calculations exceeds anything in Miss Pike's background. Her confession describes extraction methods that would have produced ineffective results at best. Kent's response maintained perfect courtesy, though Miss Marple detected the subtle, defensive quality creeping into his voice. Surely these tragic cases often involve hidden capabilities beyond what backgrounds might suggest. The psychological examination. Miss Marple's gentle interjection shifted the atmosphere with devastating effect. Indeed, Mr. Kent, hidden capabilities prove crucial in understanding such complex crimes. Your expertise in botanical materials, gained through antique authentication work, must provide fascinating insights into traditional preservation methods and plant-based treatments. The seemingly innocent observation struck its target with precision. Kent's automatic correction of a deliberately misstated detail about alcohol-based extraction revealed intimate familiarity with advanced techniques no legitimate dealer could possess. His description of concentration procedures and purification processes demonstrated knowledge gained through deadly practice rather than professional necessity. The measuring vial discovered among your belongings, Miss Marple continued with characteristic mildness, reminded Dr. Alderwick of equipment used for preparing exact medicinal dosages, though I suppose someone with different purposes might find similar tools useful for entirely different applications. Kent's immediate inquiry about the vial's contents and visible relief, when told it appeared empty, betrayed intimate knowledge of materials and methods only the true murderer could possess. The complete revelation. Lady Agnes was a creature of rigid habit, Miss Marple explained, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm. Her evening peppermint ritual, the precise placement of her silver tin, the predictable selection of the largest sweet first, all provided perfect opportunities for systematic poisoning by someone with unrestricted access to her private chambers. Inspector Slack's systematic presentation revealed the planted evidence in Nora's room, the technical impossibilities in her supposed method, and the sophisticated planning that characterized the actual crime. The face powder tin showed signs of recent disturbance, the fingerprint impressions indicated hasty placement, and the timing eliminated Nora's involvement entirely. Your fraudulent substitution of reproductions for authentic pieces during appraisal visits, Slack continued relentlessly, created the motive for murder when Lady Agnes discovered your systematic theft and threatened exposure that would have destroyed your reputation and led to criminal prosecution. The final truth. Under accumulated pressure, Kent's carefully maintained facade began its inevitable collapse. His protests became desperate, his explanations contradictory, and his attempts to redirect suspicion increasingly transparent. The breakthrough came when chemical analysis revealed digitalis traces in 3 additional peppermints, evidence of systematic tampering that extended far beyond the single fatal dose. How could you possibly know which mints might contain poison? Miss Marple asked with gentle persistence, unless you were intimately familiar with their preparation and placement. Kent's struggle between continued deception and inevitable exposure played across his features with painful clarity. When his confession finally came, it carried the exhausted relief of someone whose elaborate deception had become too burdensome to maintain. He had systematically poisoned Lady Agnes for months, using legitimate business access to study her habits while preparing hollowed peppermints with confectionery skills learned in his youth. As Inspector Slack placed Kent under arrest and arrangements were made for his transport to Much Benham, Miss Marple reflected on the case's resolution with quiet satisfaction. The real killer had been exposed, the innocent girl would be freed, and justice would finally be served. The frost that had decorated St. Mary Mead throughout the investigation was melting under strengthening sun, transforming their village's crystalline beauty into the familiar landscape of ordinary life, though Miss Marple understood that beneath the surface, the eternal struggle between good and evil continued its delicate dance. The first week of January brought a peculiar quality of light to St. Mary Mead, as if the winter sun were attempting to wash away the shadows that murder had cast over their peaceful village. The frost that had decorated their lanes during the investigation melted under strengthening warmth, transforming the crystalline beauty into familiar, muddy practicalities of ordinary life, though Miss Marple understood that beneath the surface, profound changes had taken root. The healing begins. Nora Pike returned to her aunt's cottage with the hollow-eyed relief of someone not yet daring to believe in salvation. Miss Marple arrived with seed cake and the calm assurance that things, being what they were, could be made right by degrees. The young woman's hands still trembled when she poured tea, but her voice carried new strength when she spoke of her plans to seek employment in a neighboring village where her confectionery skills might find honest application. Inspector Slack said a mistake can be mended if not forgotten, Nora managed, eyes fixed on the steam rising from the kettle. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. Forgetting is a poor gardener, my dear. Memory, with proper pruning, lets new growth flourish. The revelation of Lionel Kent's systematic fraud had transformed Julian Weatherby's inheritance from a burden of debt into a complex legal battle to reclaim stolen family treasures. Kent's confession revealed years of replacing authentic pieces with expert reproductions during his appraisal visits, selling the originals through London dealers while Lady Agnes remained unaware of the substitutions. When she discovered the deception through an independent valuation, her threats of exposure had sealed her fate. Julian stood one long hour at the library window, calculating his choices with newfound clarity. The estate's problems remained formidable, but Kent's thefts, once recovered through legal proceedings, might provide sufficient resources to preserve Weatherby Hall for future generations. His initial relief at his mother's death now seemed a tragic irony, replaced by genuine grief and a belated appreciation for Lady Agnes's fierce protection of their family legacy. Professional reckonings. Dr. Alderwick made his rounds with new humility, his failure to diagnose the chronic digitalis poisoning weighing heavily on his medical conscience. In his surgery's ledger, he drew a careful line beneath Lady Agnes Weatherby's name and sat quietly afterward, glasses in hand, thinking of small symptoms and the large meanings they sometimes carried. His visit to apologize to Nora had been painful, but necessary. "You could not have known," she had said with characteristic gentleness. "I could have wondered sooner," he replied, finding that acknowledgment satisfied his conscience better than forgiveness might have done. Inspector Slack walked the village with unusual softness in his tread, as if reluctant to disturb the surface of the very place that had corrected his professional assumptions. His experience with Kent's sophisticated deception had taught him valuable lessons about accepting convenient solutions rather than pursuing uncomfortable truth. Community reflection. The Reverend Latchford's Sunday sermons took on new depth as he addressed themes of forgiveness, compassion, and the dangers of hasty judgment. His youthful enthusiasm had been tempered by harsh realities of human fallibility, but Charlotte supported him with quiet strength as the village gradually absorbed the lessons of their collective failure to protect an innocent girl from false accusation. Mrs. Cray resumed her choir mistress duties with characteristic efficiency, though she insisted on additional rehearsals to restore the carol service's disrupted harmony. Timothy Hartwell's voice had finally broken completely, but he sang the lower parts with new maturity, understanding that change, however difficult, marked natural progression rather than loss. Old Mr. Giles trimmed the foxglove stalks with respectful caution, explaining to anyone who would listen that plants themselves held no malice. Only human hands could transform natural beauty into instruments of destruction. Miss Marple's final observations. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the case's resolution while arranging winter chrysanthemums in her sitting room. Kent's crime had succeeded temporarily because it exploited the community's tendency to accept obvious explanations rather than questioning comfortable assumptions about guilt and innocence. His willingness to sacrifice Nora Pike to protect his own freedom demonstrated the particular cruelty of those who viewed other human beings as expendable resources in their personal schemes. The truth, like the winter light that had finally illuminated Kent's deception, possessed a crystalline clarity that no amount of sophisticated planning could permanently obscure. Human nature, in all its complexity and capacity for both creation and destruction, continued to reveal itself to those patient enough to observe carefully and wise enough to understand what they witnessed. The pattern completes. That night, Miss Marple drew her curtains, set fresh flowers in water, and smiled with quiet satisfaction. The pattern was complete. Justice had been served, and the village, bruised yet mending, settled back into itself, with the resilient grace that had sustained St. Mary Mead through countless seasons of human folly and redemption. The Christmas candlelight glow would forever carry memories of murder and deception, but also of truth, triumphant and innocence vindicated. A reminder that even in the coziest settings, vigilance and compassion must stand eternal guard against the darker impulses of the human heart. By Twelfth Night, winter's grip on St. Mary Mead had begun to loosen, though the village bore invisible scars that would never entirely fade. The frost that had decorated their lanes during the investigation melted under strengthening sun, transforming crystalline beauty into the familiar muddy practicalities of ordinary life. Yet beneath the surface, profound changes had taken root in the hearts of those who had witnessed how easily justice could have been perverted by convenience and assumption. justice and resolution. Lionel Kent's trial concluded with a verdict that surprised no one familiar with the evidence, though the full scope of his criminal enterprise shocked even seasoned observers. His systematic fraud had extended across 3 counties, involving dozens of elderly collectors whose trust he had exploited while methodically replacing their treasures with expert forgeries. The judge's sentence of 25 years reflected both the premeditated nature of Lady Agnes's murder and his callous willingness to sacrifice an innocent girl to protect his freedom. Julian Weatherby's inheritance, once recovered through legal proceedings, proved sufficient to preserve Weatherby Hall while providing modest security for future generations. His mother's fierce protection of their family legacy, which had seemed merely stubborn pride during her lifetime, now appeared as prescient wisdom. He maintained the estate with new appreciation for Lady Agnes's sacrifices and belated understanding of inherited responsibility. Lives rebuilt. Nora Pike found employment at a confectionery shop in the neighboring market town, where her skills earned respect and her gentle manner attracted loyal customers. The scandal of her false arrest had initially seemed insurmountable, but Miss Marple's quiet recommendations and Dr. Alderwick's public acknowledgement of investigative errors gradually restored her reputation. She visited her aunt regularly, though both understood that St. Mary Mead would always carry associations that time might soften, but never completely erase. Dr. Alderwick continued his practice with new humility, his failure to diagnose chronic digitalis poisoning having taught valuable lessons about accepting obvious explanations for complex symptoms. His medical journal now included careful notes about botanical poisoning, and he had established correspondence with toxicology experts whose expertise might prevent future tragedies. Inspector Slack returned to Much Benham with professional reputation intact, but personal confidence appropriately shaken. His subsequent cases received more careful attention to detail and less eagerness for convenient closures. He maintained respectful correspondence with Miss Marple, acknowledging her crucial role in preventing a miscarriage of justice that would have haunted his career permanently. Miss Marple's gentle revelation. During Inspector Slack's final visit, Miss Marple explained her deductive process with characteristic understatement. It was only the smallest matters, you know. A scent that did not belong to church or holly. A peppermint that was chalky when all the rest were clear. Sugar dust beneath the pew, quite as if someone had worked with confectioner's sugar. She described how Lady Agnes's particular habits, her evening peppermint ritual, always selecting the largest sweet first, her preference for pure lozenges, overcreams, had provided perfect opportunities for systematic poisoning by someone with unrestricted access to her private chambers. The hairbrush bearing uncharacteristic white residue, the missing icing sugar from the larder, the bedside tin replaced an inch awry, all small details that revealed where large deceptions had been carefully orchestrated. Community wisdom. The Reverend Latchford's sermons reflected new maturity gained through witnessing human nature's capacity for both cruelty and redemption. His youthful certainties had been tempered by harsh realities, but Charlotte's steady support helped him develop pastoral wisdom necessary for guiding a community through moral complexity. Mrs. Cray resumed her choir mistress duties with characteristic efficiency, though she insisted on additional rehearsals to restore the carol service's disrupted harmony. The Christmas Eve service would continue, but with deeper appreciation for the fragility of peace and the importance of protecting the innocent from hasty judgment. Eternal vigilance. As spring approached and daffodils pushed through soil that had witnessed so much deception, Miss Marple tended her garden with particular satisfaction. She reflected that Kent's crime had succeeded temporarily because it exploited the community's tendency to accept obvious explanations rather than questioning comfortable assumptions about guilt and innocence. The case had demonstrated how sophisticated criminals could mask systematic activity behind legitimate professional relationships, while preparing innocent scapegoats to bear responsibility for their crimes. Most significantly, it revealed the crucial importance of maintaining compassionate skepticism toward convenient solutions and pursuing uncomfortable truths that challenged established assumptions. That evening, arranging late roses in her sitting room, Miss Marple understood that St. Mary Mead's peaceful exterior would always conceal the eternal struggle between human virtue and corruption. The village's strength lay not in evil's absence, but in the community's capacity to recognize truth through patient observation, protect innocence when circumstances threatened it, and ensure that justice, however delayed, ultimately prevailed over deception. The Christmas candlelight glow would forever carry memories of murder and redemption, a reminder that even in the coziest settings, vigilance and compassion must stand eternal guard against the darker impulses of the human heart. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, that vigilance represented not burden but privilege, the opportunity to serve truth and protect innocence in a world where both remained perpetually vulnerable to those who valued personal advantage above human decency.